So I'm going to do a Rafael Pavarotti breakdown from this shoot. I'm just going to do one of the setups because I think it's really helpful to understand a way to construct lighting. It's not like the definitive this is how it was done, but it will give you a good starting point to begin to think about how to work with a lighting like this and to work with a slightly bigger setup. I'm also going to look at a volume lighting that he uses, but I'll do that in a second video. This will just be concentrating on this one setup today. One of the things that's really important about this lighting is to understand how it works on different skin tones and what he's doing with levels of contrast and how you can get away with kind of a stronger highlight, stronger top light on darker skin, still get a dramatic feel to it. But if you were to shoot the same kind of lighting setup on a lighter skin model, it would tend not to be as effective visually. Also, it's really good to think about like what is the styling that he's using here? Like what is the set design, art direction, the hair and makeup, like all of those things really kind of bring something else, another level to his work. It's not just like good photography and lighting. But let's just kind of jump into it. So I'm going to recreate this bench setup. I just made a rough new object in Satellite. You can import your own 3D objects into the Satellite software. So I just imported a chair and literally just stretched it, which is what you can see here. This is why it looks a little bit weird because it's not actually a bench, it's just a stretched chair, but it's fine, we can deal with that. Also, like I've tried to kind of work on the models here a little bit, get a rough idea of pose, but I don't want to spend like all of my time just posing the models because that's not helpful and it's not why people are here, I don't think. I've tried to match some of the skin tones. The skin tones are not amazing on Satellite because it's kind of a hard thing to actually get accurate. There's a lot more kind of darker blue skin tone in the images that he's using, and also there's darker reds on the undertones. So there's something to consider, but that's fine. We can kind of deal with this because the main thing we're looking at is the lighting. So let's look at our studio space. I just zoom out here. I've got a fairly big studio with this, so 10 meters long. I'm not using the full length of the studio in this one. 9 meters wide, 5 meters high. It's sort of an editorial space. That's fine. Nothing in here. I've just got a blank at the minute. I've got a brown flat essentially on the floor. And the first thing we can do is we're just going to check what our camera is set at. So I've got like a 35mm lens. I've set it ISO 800. I've set the ISO quite high just because it's got me a little bit of latitude to play with because I roughly know what I'm going to do with my lighting here. But also if I could swap this to like video later because I'm going to use constant lighting for this. It's a similar principle with Flash, but we can look at it in a separate. And I've got my starting point as f8. Like I said before, I always try and start like f8 or f11. Normally f8, ideally in the studio, is like a good midpoint. So if you need to change aperture later, it's fine. It's not going to throw everything off. So let's just add some flats into this. And all I've done is I'll just show you exactly what this is as well. So yeah, all I've done is taken from the props. There's numerous ways to do this, but I've essentially taken like a box and made it like whatever this is. 5 meters by 220. 220 is roughly the size of a flat, so that's fine. Let's take that back out again. And then I've just made it brown. A rough color match to what I think he's got in the picture. And it's not super reflective. That's kind of important. So if you look at here, the glossiness, like it's a fairly matte wall as if it's like freshly painted. That's also going to help us. And that's going to be quite important later. And then I'm introducing one light. And we can see this in this preview image up in the top corner. That'll give us a rough idea of what the camera's seeing. It's not super accurate, but it's accurate enough to kind of figure out how we want to kind of proceed with things. And this light that I've got in here is the new light that they've added in Satellite, which is the Aputure 1200 Pro. So it's a fairly high-powered light. I've also tried to use this because like the 600, the Aputure equipment is relatively cheap, right? This is the more powerful light that they've got. If you were to use the 600, then you'd just be changing ISO rather than changing the aperture. But let's just stick with this right now. I've got a 1200. I've just got the normal modifier on it, so it's like the kind of big reflector, 75% in terms of power. There's no gel on here. And if we look where it is, it's just angled pretty much over the middle of the bench. Height of it, again, let's check that. It's 3 meters 30. We've kind of got what we'd expect, right? That we've got some light that's spilling onto the background. It's hot kind of in the middle of the image. It's hot on the forehead, noses. We're getting this top-down definition. The light is not really reaching the model on either end, so that's a bit of a problem. If we look at our histogram, we've not got what we need at all with the histogram. There's a lot of like really heavy blacks and sort of a blown out highlight. And let's look at the view version of this. And this is the rendered shot, right? So what we're trying to do with this is just get the sense of we want this top-down lighting, which is important in his image. We don't want this huge center to it. So the natural thing I would start to do is go, do I need to kind of spread that lighting out a little bit? And there's always different ways you could do this, right? So you might be looking at this and think, well, I just want to put a big strip softbox on. That could be one way of doing it. But in this version, what I'm going to do, and it will kind of become clear a little bit later why I want to do that, is I'm just going to replicate that light. So I've got this Aputure 1200. I'm just going to stick another one on this side and another one on this side. I've got them roughly the same power. I'm just literally throwing them in, the same height. Pretty much if you look from the top, same distance apart. If we look at the preview image there, it's doing what we'd expect it to do. It takes out that sense of the middle being the real center. Let's just compare these two side by side. You can see all that light's hitting the backdrop, so the brown has become really washed out. We don't have that big kind of like center of the light now, so that's fine. The highlights are too strong. There's just too much shadow and too much contrast in the image, but we're going to work with this as our starting point. I haven't changed any of the camera settings at this stage. And like I recommend in lots of these videos, once you've got your f-stop in place and your ISO, don't really change anything until you've begun to kind of really layer the light, because otherwise you won't know what you're changing. It's so much more important to keep the camera settings in place and get your lighting right rather than keep changing camera settings. So the next thing that I'm going to do with this, and this is what I recommend doing if you're in a studio, is putting some kind of diffusion panel over the front. There's lots of different sizes of diffusion that you can get. But with this one, I've got like a 5 meter by 4 meter. I've kind of matched this to work with the set I've actually got. But you might end up with like a 12 by 12 or a 16 by 16, depending on whatever your set is and how many people you've got into it. And then the light reduction here, which is kind of important, I've got this at 2/3. So I'm pushing the light through this. It just means that it's going to be softer. It's not going to have those hot spots to it. You can get different values, of those diffusion panels. So you can get like a 1/3 stop, a 1/2 stop, a full stop, and so on. It just means that a different amount of light will pass through. And if we look at what's happening here, and this is like fairly accurate, you've got these sort of 3 hot spots that you would see. It's a little less obvious than that when you actually put like a diffusion frame on, but we've got these hot lights with the reflectors on them, so they're kind of quite a center to them, and they're just pushing into that diffusion panel. What you can do is obviously once you kind of get happy with this is vary the height that you want with the rigging, but you may find you're limited by what you need to rig it to or what stands you're using and so on. You would probably use some double wind-ups or something to kind of fix this in place. The other thing, if you're not familiar with rigging something over people, you've obviously always got to be like super careful that something's not going to fall down. It's not going to fall on the people. So obviously my lights here would be like rigged to the ceiling, or they'd be rigged to a scaffold frame or whatever they would be. Probably at this height, I wouldn't then have like a wind up with an arm on it. I would probably rig it overhead. And the same with the net. Just be careful whenever you're putting something over someone. Spin around the set so we know like nothing else has changed at this point. Camera position's fine. And let's see what we're getting with this and compare those previous with the no diffusion panel over the top. And you can see that if you look in the preview image on the right hand side, you'll see what changes with this. Then we've got diffusion panel. So let's compare them side by side. And immediately it's giving us a much more editorial feel to the light. Light just looks more premium when you put it through a diffusion panel. I guess we're used to seeing light like this, but also it gives that feel of a kind of slightly overcast day. A lot of the commercial editorial photography you will see will be shot like this with diffusion panels, nets, and so on, passing light through something to make it softer. It's great for bringing out definition on the face because it's a top-down light. As humans, we're used to seeing things that are top-down lit, obviously because where the sun is. So we can see really what it's done here of softening off that light, but it's really controlled the movement of light to shade. So let's look at this model here in the background and just circle now. Let's look at that highlight on her cheekbones. And yes, it's defining the face, but then everything else falls off into shadow. It's really intense and harsh. But when we put that net on, the light sort of softens, it spreads, it bounces around a little bit more. And the fall off from light to shade is quite nice. It's actually shaping the face, but we can suddenly see like the neck, for example. And that's really great. And let's say if we see this model on this side, actually now the light is hitting the diffusion and it's kind of spreading out, we can see both sides of her face, which we couldn't see before because it was kind of trapped in this harsh light from the shadow. So overall, that's kind of nice. We're not getting these hot spots on the front of the bench also. That's kind of good. The floor is kind of softer. Again, ignore like the feet positions and so on. It's just a rough thing that I've done with the models here. But it's a nice soft light. And also the other thing to notice is that what's happened with the background, we've got a realistic color on the background now because that diffusion panel is controlling that light really effectively and it's not overexposing. So we've got an accurate brown. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to maybe like soften that light off a little bit more so it's not just like a top-down light. That would be kind of an important thing to do for us now. So all I've done here is I've got 2 bounces. So we'll just look at these separately. This one here is just a polyboard that I've angled, But again, there's lots of different forms of bounce you could use for this. You could use another diffusion panel. You could use a polyboard that's angled or tilted. Again, when you're using bounce light, it's really important once you get a handle of it to kind of decide how subtle or how obvious you want your light to be. So like a silver is going to be obviously really bouncy. It's going to be kind of obvious. It will give this little up light that might be super distracting. You might see it in the catch lights and eyes. Whereas with a soft white bounce, you probably won't see that. It's just filling in a little bit. And all I'm trying to do is catch some of this stray light that's coming down and just pushing it back towards the model. And then I've got another diffusion panel here. Let's just spin that around. So this one is a 3x2. Again, you might have like a 4x4 or 2x2, 12x12. I'm moving between like metric and imperial all the time because it depends where you'll be. And hopefully that's not super confusing. But also some things are always imperial. You'll get a 12x12 in places where they have metric measurements. It's just a weird part of the film and photography industry. Okay, so I've got this angled. I'm bouncing back off this 2/3 stop for the light to go through. And then this one is a half stop. And again, we'll kind of see why that could change in a minute. But we're essentially just trying to bounce light back in. So the next thing I want to do is really understand what my bounce light is doing. And I want to give it something else to work with. So in the simulation, I've taken these 3 lights out. Obviously, you would just turn them off when you're doing this. And I've got another Aputure 1200 here. I'm using the same lights all the way through in this, in each area, because I think it's just helpful to understand nothing else is changing. So you can say the unit is always the same, but the power is changing, for example. So I've got this 1200 on 100. So it's on max power, and I'm bouncing it into this half stop. So some of the light is going to like pass through this, some of it's going to bounce. If I wanted like a 1 stop, or if this was like a silver or an ultra bounce, you would get different effects from that. So I'm pushing the light into it, bouncing back into the model, and all I'm trying to do is lift up the front, a little bit of a fill light. So let's just have a look at that. And you can see there's not a huge amount happening here, but the image is really dark. The models are dark skinned, the set is brown, the models are all wearing black. So we're not going to pick up a huge amount, but you can see there's a little bit of a lift, and actually you would pick that up in your digital shots. But we're not done yet, so it's fine. But also you can see it's like picking up the whites of the eyes a little bit. And that's where it's always good to shoot your additional lights or your fill cards separately, because then you can see exactly what they're doing. Let's compare this. So this is the overhead light, the 3 lights overhead and with the bounce. And then this is just the front fill without those overhead lights. And then obviously you can kind of tell what we're going to do next. I'm going to begin to try and even that out, right? So I want to accent a little bit. I don't want just a top light and a fill. I want to be able to kind of dive into the frame a little bit with some lighting. And if you look at the original image again, you can see there's some cross shadows on the floor. You can see there's cross shadows on the feet. Again, this is not exactly what the photographer would do in this situation. It just gives you a starting point to think, okay, what do I need to add to the picture? So he's got some cross lights coming in. It makes it more 3D, less flat. It's just helpful. And it picks out some of the detail that would be lost in all the black clothing otherwise. So I've got another Aputure 1200, 85% here, and another one that's 100 at the back. So let's just look at those. If you look at this preview image on the right-hand side, I'm going to put that as a solar light. We'll take a minute to kind of read that. And you can see that some of that light's pushing through. It's probably picking a little bit of bounce from the front, it's picking a little of this bounce car, but mainly it's just pushing this light into the back of the frame, right? So we're kind of seeing that on the image there. Then let's just put this front one. Takes a second to read it. And you can see that's picking up again on the front bench, for example. It's picking up in the chest. Everywhere where the skin is going to reflect back, then that's going to pick up that light. So that's going to be really helpful. And then we already know what this light is doing here. So let's compare our front fill and our front and top fill now. So you can see that top fill is really giving us something. I didn't want to go like completely opposite to what the original top light was doing. I just want to begin to even it out a little bit. So I've got front and back with that. Then the other option I wanted to show you with this is the difference if I wanted to push light through this. So let me just turn these lights off. Well, let me just put this as solo. So all I've done is I've moved my 1200 to the other side of the diffusion panel, and I'm pushing it directly through at the model's faces. And we can see that here in this preview image. And you can see that actually it's picking up a lot more than if I was bouncing it. But I feel it's a little bit obvious, and actually I prefer the bounce feel of it because that's a little bit softer. It's giving me a bit more kind of broad coverage when I'm bouncing it. It's maybe not so hot on the front bench, which you can see here it is kind of hot in this area. So again, that's just something where you want to decide, like, how do I want to play with this light? Because I'm pushing everything through diffusion panels, my front light, I decided I just want to bounce it. I think it's nicer that way. And let's just compare those two. So if we compare the top fill and the front face, let's see those together. And there's not a huge amount in it. This is the one on the right-hand side is where the light is pushing through the diffusion panel straight at the model. There's not a huge amount in it, but if you compare, say, like this area here and here, it's brighter here. It's picking up maybe a little bit too much on the model. See the front of the bench. For me, it looks a little bit hot. And everything is just a little bit too obvious when I'm pushing that light through. So I'm just preferring to bounce it in this situation. And now let's put everything in. So let's just kind of zoom around the set, see what we've got here. I've got 75, 75, and 75 pretty much on the top. All at the same height. They're pushing overhead. That's 85. I think it was 100 right at the back. So you can see roughly what we're trying to do with that. We've got this strip of light over the top, a bit of a front fill, a back fill, and then this really soft fill from the front, and then this other fill card that's coming in. So I'm trying to kind of wrap a volume of light around the models, but still have a dominant feeling from above. Now, when I've added all of those lights in, let's look at that as a preview image, and it's fine. But what I feel it's done is it's kind of lost some of that sense of the top of the light. Everything's become a little bit too kind of overexposed tonally, and maybe it doesn't work quite so much. So this is the point where I go, okay, maybe that's where I want to change my ISO or my f-stop, for example. And that's what I've done in this final setup. So everything is the same in this, but all I've done is I've changed my ISO here. So I put my ISO to 400, and it was 800 before. So let's look at those two images side by side. All the lights ISO 800, and this is all the lights ISO 400. Everything sits back. It sits nicely in place, and I've made that adjustment that I'm fairly happy with, that I'm happy to do on set, and go, yeah, it's okay to shoot that way. I wouldn't want to kind of do a full setup and then suddenly change my f-stop and my ISO at the same time. I have photographers that do that, and it suddenly becomes really confusing of what are the ratios that need to change for things. So I would always say try and do that when you're at the final stage of what you're wanting to do on set. And this begins to kind of sit together quite nicely. If I look at what I would do with this now to get this perfected in camera, and once I've got my models in place and know what hair and makeup is and final looks, I would probably say actually I want a little bit more dominance from the top, and I would begin to maybe turn down the fills a little bit, and I would have this row being a little bit more powerful, for example. As we've looked at in other videos, gelling a highlight can make it sit back a little bit. So if I was to put a warm tone here, it would sit back on the skin a little more, and it would give you that feeling of the dominance of the top light. So that just gives you a quick overview of how you can fairly easily construct a set like this. The good thing about a setup like this is it allows you to change the position of the bench. The models can move around a lot, and suddenly you're not oh, well, someone is blocking a main light, because I'm filling from a lot of places, right? If I wanted to really even things out, I could put maybe another diffusion panel in here and push a light in that way. I don't need to right now, but let's say I change the idea of maybe some people are stood in a slightly different position further back from the bench, or I add another person into the set. I could put a diffusion panel here and just push a soft light in. It's not going to change the dominance of the field of the set, and that's going to be fine. The other thing that I could look at with this, let's say take this light up here. If I want to bring someone forward, I could maybe bring this light down here, and let's just tilt the angle on that. It's a little bit more centered. It's picking out the person at the front, for example. And similar kind of thing, if I wanted to lose that feel, I could push it back a little bit more, and I could angle it forward. So then suddenly it's going to be about the light kind of flooding past and sitting on the cheekbones. Again, it's really going to depend on what the hair and makeup has achieved, for example, and how you've communicated that. And that's kind of a good starting point, really, to understand, okay, I've built the set, I've got diffusion panels around, it's fairly easy to rig. Obviously, there's quite a few lights in here, but you've got a lot of models in this setup. So if you've got that many models, you should have enough money to get enough lights for it. If you were going to reduce this down to 2 or 3 people in the set, then you could take away this top light here, take away this top light, so you're just one from the top. You could just keep this light, but maybe you wouldn't need this front fill light. So essentially you've got 1, 2, 3 lights then. And again, that's fairly easy to get that nice setup for 2 people. So there you have it. It's kind of a fairly simple way of doing this. If you wanted to say use strobes for this, then let's say we would take this light out here. We could put a big octa and push that through a diffusion panel. That would be nice. If you don't have one of these big diffusion panels available, you couldn't hire it, then big softboxes, big octas will do the same thing. Ideally, if you've got an octa, you would then put like a grid on it so it's not spreading the light out too far, or you would hang off of it so that it's not kind of pushing forward into the frame too much. Again, if you haven't got, say, like a big diffusion panel for the front, you could, let me just show you. I won't actually set it up, but let me just show you what I could do with this. We could just have a big octa here in place, right? So we could just take this out, and then we've got an octa pushing from the front. And similar thing, you could have octa over the top. These big frames are really great though for creating soft diffuse light. And it's really nice in a setup to get a good strong top light for it. So hopefully that's helpful. Gives a good starting point to kind of think if I wanted to set something up like this myself, what would I do? What are the next steps that I would take with that? I've got a couple of other setups from Rafael Pavarotti that I'm going to work through in other videos. So if you like that, watch the next one. And thanks so much for all the people that have watched already. I really appreciate everyone that is watching these videos. It's really great. Thank you.